and it can escape from the predator. Minutes after walking, I also saw the insects, observing for any movement of any reptile. The kestrel actually got a bit spooked out by the Rufous Treepie fine rodents. The squirrel actually making alarm calls, and the Indian rat snake, I saw it trying to catch a squirrel as well. It was really high up in the canopy marine tide pools. I actually saw that have a stinger that slithering across the mountain rock. Super fascinating animals, because not only do they actually run a little bit on the water when they start flying, do that for thermoregulation. They're fish that spend 90% of their life on land above water, so that jackals and other animals can actually not prey on their nest eggs. Rufous woodpecker eating ants. The jackal saw the Dhole and literally turned right back and started running away as fast as it could in the other direction. Swam towards the bullfrog. Hi guys, welcome back to my wildlife podcast. So I really hope you guys liked the previous 2 episodes of my wildlife podcast, and I literally love talking about nature and wildlife. And in today's episode, I'm gonna start off the same way I started the previous 2 episodes, by telling you guys a little bit about the trails I went for this week and the birds and animals that I saw. And this week I actually went for 2 morning trails. The first morning trail that I went for, when I started walking, literally a few feet of walking, I saw a really beautiful forest calotus lizard. This is one of the most stunning lizards ever. They're black in color with a really striking, vivid orange coloring on the top. And these lizards basically are arboreal as well as terrestrial lizards. They hunt for insects, they're insectivores, and they eat beetles, ants, grasshoppers, and other tiny insects on the trees as well as on the ground. And what's super fascinating about these lizards is that they can actually change their color. And what I mean by that is that they're really bright orange on the top, right? So they can actually dim this orange in case there's a predator lurking nearby, like probably an arboreal snake or a crescent serpent eagle, since crescent serpent eagles primarily eat reptiles like snakes, but also other reptiles like the forest calotus and Oriental garden lizard. So in case there's a predator nearby, the forest calotus can actually dim the orange and it can escape from the predator, so that the predator doesn't spot it, because the orange is basically so bright that the predator might spot it. So this is a super fascinating trait about the forest calotus lizards. And a few minutes after walking, I also saw a lot of Oriental garden lizards. And if you guys don't know, Oriental garden lizards are again diurnal species like the forest calotus lizards, and they're again insectivores. They primarily eat ants and grasshoppers, butterflies, and there are a lot of times on the small bushes in the jungles, where green vine snakes also reside, since they're diurnal snakes, and they basically feed on the Oriental garden lizards that are waiting on the bushes to eat the insects. So it's super fascinating how these diurnal species can be seen during the day. But after I saw these two lizard species, I saw a really beautiful yellow-throated sparrow. And what I find super fascinating about yellow-throated sparrows is that, unlike common house sparrows, which nest near buildings, near cities and residential areas, yellow-throated sparrows actually love living in dry deciduous jungles. And when they live in dry deciduous jungles, they actually don't build their own nest. They actually find like a nest of probably a coppersmith barbet, which is like a hollow in the tree, or another bird's nest, which is like a hole in the tree, and they that the bird doesn't use anymore. Like if the coppersmith barbet is not using that nest anymore, then the yellow-throated sparrow will actually move into that nest, and they line the nest with feathers and with a lot of hay, and they basically make it they line it. And there's a lot of since it's not a nest that they have built, they have a lot of competition from other birds as well that might want to make that nest their own. And what's also super fascinating is that these birds, yes, they're primarily insectivores. They eat a lot more insects than the common house sparrow. Common house sparrows are mostly seed eaters, but the yellow-throated sparrows are primarily insectivores, and they eat insects on the trees. But what's super fascinating is that these yellow-throated sparrows actually, when they drink the nectar from trees like flame of the forest and the red silk cotton tree, a lot of the times the orange pollen actually gets stuck on their forehead, and that's how they're really great pollinators as well. And I really find yellow-throated sparrows to be super fascinating. And after seeing the yellow-throated sparrows, I actually saw a really beautiful bird that I had never seen before. I saw the Indian Pitta, and what I find super fascinating about these birds when I read up about them later was that these birds basically are terrestrial feeders like the myna. They basically find their food by rummaging on the forest floor and moving the leaves with their mouth, and basically the insects that start crawling, they feed on them just like how mynas do. So they're terrestrial feeders, and they're really beautiful birds. They have a really striking green bluish color, and they're one of the most beautiful birds I've ever seen. And what's super fascinating is, since they're terrestrial feeders, they move a lot over India depending on weather and temperature, and where the soil is actually soft, and there are a lot of earthworms during that time, so they can feed. So basically, during the breeding season, they actually reside in the foothills of the Himalayas and in central India, because the climate stays perfect for them, and the soil is quite soft during that time, so there's a lot of abundance of insects and earthworms that they can feed on. And after their breeding season, they actually move to the south, to the western Ghats and to the south of India. And what's super fascinating is that these birds are really, really beautiful, and they have a very distinct call in the jungle. A lot of the times, you'll be able to hear them if it's their breeding season, before even spotting them. And they're one of the most fascinating birds. And I actually saw a couple of Indian pittas that day. So that was one of the most beautiful sightings ever. And after that, what was really, really fascinating was, when I was walking, I actually saw a barking deer. And this was the first time that I have seen a barking deer during a trail. It was really, really far. It was at the end of the trail. Like really far, but I saw it and I knew it was a barking deer. Basically, you guys, they're called barking deer because when they see a predator like a leopard or another predator, like probably if they saw a jackal also maybe, then they make alarm calls, and the alarm calls sound like the barking of a dog. And this is super fascinating because I literally have seen barking deer so many times before in Kanha and other jungles during safaris, but this was the first time that I saw a barking deer during a trail, and that was literally so amazing. And what else? After that, I saw a really beautiful spotted owlet, and I literally love it whenever I see spotted owlets during the day, because I've seen a lot of spotted owlets during the evening, but I have never ever, like, actually I have seen a couple of spotted owlets in the early evening, but this was the first time that I saw a spotted owlet literally in the morning. So that was super, super fascinating. It was resting in the hollow of a tree, and I saw it. It was super, super beautiful. And what else? After I started walking, I also saw the red wattled lapwing, and I literally love the red wattled lapwing, and I just want to talk a little more about the red wattled lapwing with you guys. So these birds are literally so fascinating because a really unique trait about them is that, unlike other birds that build nests, whether it's on a tree or whether it's on old structures like the old abandoned walls near houses and stuff like that, or wherever birds build their nests, um, what's really, really fascinating about the red wattle lapwing is that they actually build their nest by making a tiny hole in the ground, literally on the ground, and they lay their eggs there, and they line the nest with goats' droppings, like goats' poop droppings, or small stones and pebbles. And their eggs are naturally dark gray and that color, so they naturally look like stones as well. So it's really well camouflaged on the ground, so the predators, until they're really close to the eggs, they can't actually tell that they're eggs or rocks, so they're really well camouflaged. Another thing that I find super fascinating about red wattle lapwings is that most birds are either diurnal, crepuscular, or nocturnal. These birds are diurnal and nocturnal, so they're super fascinating. I've mostly seen them around water bodies. Once, just once, during a safari that I've been to, I also saw the yellow wattled lapwing. That was super beautiful. I think that was in Kanha, I'm not too sure, but they're one of the most beautiful birds. And after that, I also saw the grey fronted green pigeon again. This is such a beautiful bird, you guys. What an amazing, beautiful bird. And after that, I again saw the crescent serpent eagle. And I want to talk a little bit more about the crescent serpent eagle with you guys. So, I find the crescent serpent eagle super, super fascinating for a variety of reasons. But one of the main reasons I find crescent serpent eagles fascinating is that they literally, unlike other birds like the black kite or Brahmini kites that hunt for their prey while flying, like mid-flight they hunt their prey, these birds actually sit on a tree, or they perch themselves on a cliff or something where they can see a huge amount of area, and their eyes are literally focused, and they're observing for any movement of any reptile or a snake, and then they grab the snake. And since their primary prey is snakes, they actually have special talents that can grip these snakes, and they're really fascinating birds. They also have a hood behind their head that they can release, or not release, that they can open up as a display to evade off any predators, and they're super, super fascinating birds. They literally can sit perched for hours on a tree or a branch waiting to see a snake nearby, and then they quickly go and grab the snake. And they're really one of the most beautiful birds that I've ever seen. And talking about birds of prey, after I saw the crescent serpent eagle, I also saw kestrel. And kestrels are super fascinating because I've only seen them a couple of times. And this time that I saw the kestrel, I saw something super fascinating. So there was a Rufous Treepie, okay, you guys. And Rufous Treepie are really beautiful birds. They're one of the most vividly colored birds. I'm gonna put a video over here. Rufous Treepies are such beautiful birds, and I could actually hear the calling of a Rufous Treepie, so I knew that a Rufous Treepie was perched on a tree somewhere nearby. And then I actually spotted this kestrel perched on a tree, and you're not gonna believe what I saw, you guys. I literally saw the Rufous Treepie, which is not a bird of prey. It's a bird that eats seeds and insects and fruits. So it's a frugivorous bird mostly, and it barely eats insects. Also, it mostly eats fruits. And what was super fascinating is that I actually saw this Rufous Treepie fly over to the tree where the kestrel was there, and the kestrel actually got a bit spooked out by the Rufous Treepie coming so aggressively towards it, and the Rufous Treepie actually made the kestrel fly a bit away from the tree. So it was super fascinating, and I don't know why the Rufous Treepie did that. And these trees were really far, and I could see it from the zoom on my phone. But it was super fascinating how a bird that is a frugivorous bird that eats fruits actually chased off and scared off a bird of prey. So that was super fascinating. And after that, what else did I see? I also saw the yellow-footed green pigeon again. That was really beautiful, and that was the first trail that I went for that this week. And as you guys heard, it was literally what an amazing trail that I went for. So the second trail that I went for, I actually went for a really short time because it was really sunny that day. But I saw a few birds. I saw the white-throated kingfisher. I love the white-throated kingfisher. They're one of the most beautiful birds ever because usually most species of kingfisher, like the common kingfisher that live near water bodies, eat frogs and fish and crabs and tadpoles. But the white-throated kingfisher actually eats reptiles as well and eats small mice. And there also have been a few pictures that I've seen on a few articles of kingfishers that have eaten snakes as well, tiny non-venomous snakes, so in the wild. So this is super fascinating, and I literally loved seeing this kingfisher perched on a tree near the pond. And I also saw a hoopoe that day, the Eurasian hoopoe, and they're one of the most beautiful birds as well. So what else? In that trail, I also saw the Tickle's blue flycatcher. I've seen that on a couple of trails these past few months, but the Tickle's blue flycatcher is one of the most beautiful birds. And I also saw a couple of more Oriental garden lizards as well. But those were the two trails that I went for this week. And now that I've spoken about the trails that I went for this week, I'm gonna be telling you guys 5 fascinating animals again in this podcast. Yes, I know I did this in the last 2 podcasts as well, but basically I think that this is such a cool thing to talk about each video because, like I always mention in the last 2 videos I mean that there are literally millions of animals that I find fascinating. So talking about 5 of them just is not enough because there are always going to be more animals that I want to talk about. So like the last 2 videos, I've randomly picked 5 animals that I want to talk about in today's podcast. There are millions that I find fascinating, but in today's podcast I've randomly picked 5 animals that I'm going to talk about. So the first animal that I'm going to talk about that I find super fascinating are the Indian rat snakes. So I've literally gone for thousands of trails, and I've seen Indian rat snakes so many times. And what's super fascinating is I've always seen them in such different habitats. I've seen Indian rat snakes swimming in ponds. I've seen Indian rat snakes climbing trees trying to hunt squirrels, trying to enter a nest. I have literally seen Indian rat snakes slithering on the forest floor and in such different habitats, and that's why I find them super fascinating, you guys. The fact that a lot of the times snakes have a particular habitat type, like certain snakes are arboreal, certain snakes are fossorial, certain snakes are terrestrial. Indian rat snakes are literally such fascinating snakes because they can climb trees if they want to eat a bird's egg that's there in a nest high up in the canopy of a tree. They can literally go down in the termite mounds or in holes in the ground that are made by rats to find rodents. They can even swim in water and eat frogs. They have one of the most diverse habitats and diets, and that's literally why I find them so fascinating. They have also been known to eat other snakes as well. So not only do they eat rodents, they eat birds, they eat squirrels, they eat they literally eat frogs, they eat such a diverse diet, and even other snakes and other reptiles. So I find Indian rat snakes to be super, super, super fascinating, and a lot of times I've actually seen them in different morphs as well. And I have seen them in dark gray morphs, and I've seen them in light gray morphs. I've also seen them like sometimes they'll be a little bit on the yellowish side. They're literally such beautiful snakes, you guys, and they're one of the most beautiful snakes. One of the most fascinating sightings I actually saw was once I had gone for a trail a couple of months ago, and I saw this really beautiful Indian rat snake that was crossing the trail path really far away, and it was super calm, and it was actually trying to go inside the holes and probably smell if there's any prey nearby. And after smelling the holes, it actually started climbing the tree, and that was the first time I actually saw um, this the Indian rat snake climbing a tree, and it started climbing the tree, and it was such an amazing climber, such an agile climber, literally like an arboreal snake. It climbed the tree, and after it reached the top of the tree, it was literally chasing a squirrel, and the squirrel started to make really loud alarm calls because the squirrel obviously got to know that there's an Indian rat snake that's climbing, that's slithering up the tree trying to catch it. But the squirrel actually could not go right on top of the branches because on top there were a lot of black kites that were circling as well. So it was super fascinating to see a squirrel trying to evade both these predators, the black kites from above that might pick it up, or the Indian rat snake that might slither along the branches and eat it. So it was super fascinating to see the squirrel actually making alarm calls, and the Indian rat snake, I saw it trying to catch a squirrel as well. It was one of the most amazing sights. And after that, I think two more times I have seen Indian rat snakes climbing trees. One of them was actually when it was trying to enter the nest of a bird, and the nest was really high up in the canopy, so I couldn't actually see whether there were eggs or anything. But from down, when I saw the Indian rat snake was actually going towards the nest, so that was a super fascinating sight. So Indian rat snakes are definitely the one of the most fascinating animals. And the next fascinating animal that I'm going to talk about are brittle stars. So I had actually gone exploring the tide pools a couple of months back. I've gone exploring tide pools a lot of times, but this time when I went exploring the tide pools, I actually saw a really beautiful brittle star. And these are really beautiful marine creatures that are related to starfish. And unlike starfish that move really slowly across the ocean floor, brittle star actually move with a rowing like motion where their arms actually push the ground and the water, and they move like that, and they're actually quite fast on the ocean floor. And they're actually super sensitive to light, and that's why when the temperature is really high and when it's sunny, they mostly in the intertidal zones they will be under rocks and all. And also they stay under rocks not only to stay away from the light because they're really sensitive to light. That's actually a way to stay away from the predators as well, like the herons and egrets that actually feed on them. So brittle stars are super fascinating. I've seen them a couple of times when I was exploring tide pools, but they're literally one of the most beautiful animals ever. And apart from being very sensitive to light, brittle stars, if there's a predator like an egret or heron that it doesn't end up evading, and if the egret actually grabs one of its arms, it can actually let go of that arm and regrow that arm. So just like how starfish can. And I find brittle stars to be super fascinating, that's why. And they're basically the scavengers of the tide pools. They don't hunt, actually they do hunt for tiny creatures sometimes, tiny crustaceans and stuff, but most of the time they are scavengers and they eat the detritus like the plankton and all the other dead waste and matter, organic matter that seeps by in the water or that is on the rock. They have such mucus filled arms that just like sweep off all that plankton and they just feed on that. So they're super amazing scavengers of the marine tide pools. And talking about the tide pools, I'll get back to the 5 fascinating animals in the minute. I've already said 2, I'm going to talk about the other 3 in a minute. But before I get to that, I want to talk about a little bit about exploring the tide pools. I'm going to talk about a full podcast where I talk only about exploring tide pools, but now I'm just going to touch on it a little bit. When I went exploring a couple of tide pools a few months ago, I actually saw a gobi fish, which are these really beautiful fish. They're actually venomous, but they can be found in tidal pools, and they can be found alongside other animals in the tide pools as well. And one of the other animals that I saw was a tiger prawn in another tide pool. And tiger prawns are super fascinating, as you guys must have already seen tiger prawns in the past, but this was the first time I saw tiger prawn literally alive in a tide pool eating something. It was super fascinating, and then I actually saw two more tiger prawns as well. It was super fascinating, you guys, to see tiger prawns in the wild like this in tide pools. And I also saw a couple of plovers. They're really small birds. And I saw a couple of sandpipers and stilts along the coast trying to catch the tiny gobi fish and other fish. I also saw a western reef heron as well. That was super beautiful. And I also saw a couple of snails. And these are actually snails that have a stinger that they have a probe that actually comes out that basically looks like a worm. So if there's any small crustacean like the hermit crab that probably sees this and thinks it's prey like a worm, it'll go to eat that worm, which is not actually a worm. It's the probe of the snail, and the snail actually then preys on the hermit crab as well. And talking about hermit crabs, I saw so many hermit crabs, you guys. Literally so many hermit crabs, and I saw a couple of hermit crabs near the snail as well. And the snail literally was so fascinating in the way it hunts. It actually submerges itself a little bit below the sand, so only its probe is visible above the sand. So it literally looks like a worm that's there. So a lot of the times the crustaceans like the hermit crabs feed on them. And I saw a lot of hermit crabs fighting. And what I realized is that they actually fight for shells as they outgrow their shells. They can't live in that shell anymore because the shell is too small for them. So they actually fight other hermit crabs for their shell. And a lot of times the sea snails that die, they can actually use their shells as their own as well if they outgrow their shells. So hermit crabs are super fascinating, and yeah, I can't wait to do a podcast episode where I talk about tide pools in great detail with you guys. Okay, so now the third animal I'm going to talk about that I find super fascinating are the Gunther's racer. And these snakes are one of the most beautiful snakes I've ever seen. I've actually seen the snake only once in my life till now, and it was when I went for a mountain trail, and it was actually slithering across the mountain rocks, and it was one of the most beautiful snakes I've ever seen. And when I actually read up about it later, they're one of the most rarely seen snakes, and the terrestrial snakes that a lot of the times live in arid regions and semi-arid regions, and especially on mountains as well. And these snakes have a primary diet of small lizards like skinks, and they have also been seen sometimes to eat mice as well. I find them super fascinating because when I went for this morning trail, I actually saw a really beautiful Gunther's racer slithering across the mountain, as I mentioned before. And it was one of the most beautiful snakes I'd ever seen, and it was climbing the mountain rocks so well. Although it's not an arboreal snake, it wasn't, they don't climb trees, but it was just climbing the rocks so well, and it was so perfectly suited for that terrain, and it was really well camouflaged against that terrain as well. So what a beautiful snake that I saw. Fourth animal that I'm going to be talking to you guys about is the Komodo Dragon. These animals are one of the most fascinating creatures ever. They're the largest lizard species on earth, and they can get up to 4 to even 8 feet. I have seen a few Komodo dragons in zoos that I've gone to in the past, and they're one of the most unique animals ever. They're terrestrial reptiles, and they basically have a really unique hunting mechanism where they don't actually constrict their prey. They basically bite their prey, which is usually really large mammals like deer and wild boar. And what they basically do is that they will bite these animals, and then they just follow the animal really slowly. They don't immediately try to eat it, they basically follow it for a while, and the animal basically starts dying, and then they eat the animal. And basically the Komodo dragons are endemic to certain islands, and they're super fascinating animals because not only do they have such large prey like deer and wild boar and other small mammals, but basically for a lot of time it was actually believed that they don't have venom, and that their mouth has such so much bad bacteria that when they bite their prey actually starts dying off because of the bad bacteria, and that's how they eat their prey after. But recently I read up about how I think now it's believed that they actually do have venom, and that is why the prey actually gets subdued in a couple of hours or in a few days, and they can actually eat their prey. So Komodo dragons are one of the most fascinating animals ever, and I've seen them a couple of times in zoos, as I mentioned, and they're literally super huge. I've seen a few individuals that were 8 feet long, and they're literally so huge, you guys. And yeah, they're one of the most fascinating animals in the world. Okay, so the fifth animal that I find super fascinating that I'm going to be talking about are flamingos. Flamingos are one of the most beautiful birds, and I have seen greater flamingos, lesser flamingos, and Caribbean flamingos in the wild. and they basically get their pink color from the shrimp that they eat that contain the pigment carotenoid, which gives flamingos their pink color in turn. And flamingos actually live in flocks of thousands and sometimes hundreds of thousands. And what's super fascinating is how they start flying. So they actually run a little bit on the water, and I've seen this so many times. But they literally run a little bit on the water when they start flying, and even when they're landing on the water, they run a little bit on the surface of the water. As I mentioned, they're actually born grey, black in color, and the more shrimp they eat, they get pinker. Greater flamingos are lesser pink, whereas lesser flamingos are highly pink in color. And I literally love flamingos. I have seen flamingos so many times during boat rides, and even when I have gone to explore the mangroves, I've seen a lot of different flamingos, and they're one of the most beautiful birds ever. And they actually eat these fish called mudskippers as well. Flamingos also have this really unique standing method where they stand on one leg, and they actually do that for two reasons. They do that for thermoregulation. By tucking one leg, they can actually reduce the surface area that's exposed to the sunlight, and that's how they thermoregulate. Because they're mostly diurnal birds, right? So because they're feeding during the day, they have a lot of sun exposure. So tucking one leg into the other actually helps in thermoregulation. And another reason is that they want to conserve their energy. Since they're feeding for hours, they like to conserve their energy, and they actually have a special muscle and joint system where when the leg is actually tucked like that, there's no muscle exertion, so they can stay like that for hours and continue feeding on the shrimp and the algae below. So I literally find flamingos super super fascinating. Now talking about mudskippers, mudskippers are actually fish that I've seen flamingos eat a lot of times, and mudskippers are one of the most beautiful fish ever. They're fish that spend 90% of their life on land and not in water. And what they actually do is they make burrows near the water where there's a lot of soft soil, and they're mostly found in habitats where the land and water meet, where there's a lot of brackish water near mangroves. And flamingos love eating mudskippers and other wading birds like egrets, herons, and all these other birds love walking on the mangrove coast and shores and searching for mudskippers. And mudskippers actually, because they spend 90% of their time on land, they can actually move through the mangrove mudflats by moving their pectoral fins. And in case there's a predator like an egret or heron that's trying to eat it, they have a really muscular tail that can propel them like 2 feet forward when they move it, so they can like evade the egret or heron and move to safety. And I've seen a couple of mudskippers, and I've seen flamingos feasting on mudskippers. So mudskippers are definitely one of the most fascinating animals that I've ever seen. And now that I'm talking about mangroves and mudskippers and flamingos, let me tell you guys a little bit more about my experience and what I've seen in mangroves. A few times when I went to these mangroves, I actually saw a lot of black-headed ibis, and these are one of the most beautiful birds ever. They actually make nests a lot of times in trees that are above water, so that jackals and other animals can actually not prey on their nest eggs or their young birds. And these are one of the most beautiful birds ever. I've seen them a couple of times in Pench as well and in Kanha as well. And this was the first time I actually saw them in the mangroves in Mumbai. And habitats like the mangroves and wetlands, where there's a lot of brackish water, are perfect habitats for dog-faced water snakes and glossy marsh snakes. So I have never seen both of these snakes, but I've read up so much about them. So glossy marsh snakes are actually nocturnal snakes that are mostly found near brackish water, and they basically live in tiny holes made by crabs near the mudflats of mangroves and wetlands. And both these snakes are actually nocturnal, and that is one of the reasons that I've never seen them. And the glossy marsh snake, basically most of its diet actually soft shell crabs, and it only leaves its hole at night to get out, eat the soft shell crabs, and get back into its hole. And dog-faced water snakes are highly venomous. They actually are completely nocturnal, and they wait in small tide pools at night. They ambush predators, and they don't move at all, waiting for a fish to swim by or a crab, and then they hunt those crabs. And they're one of the most venomous and one of the most fascinating snakes that I have ever seen in documentaries, and I really wish I see a dog-faced water snake once. Okay, so in my previous two podcasts, I actually had a part of the podcast where I spoke about fascinating wildlife sightings that I've had in the past. like when I saw a tiger trying to hunt an Indian gore, or when I saw a rufous woodpecker eating ants, and a lot of different wildlife sightings. And today's video as well, today's podcast, I'm gonna be telling you guys 3 wildlife sightings that I've had in the past that I found super, super, super fascinating. So one of them is actually when I'd gone for a safari in Pench and I'd seen the Indian wild dog, the Dhole, and they're one of the most fierce carnivores in the jungle. They are actually known to start eating their prey before the prey has even died, and they eat really large ungulates like sambar deer, chital deer. So it's super fascinating. And I actually was on a safari in Pench, and it was the afternoon, and we basically saw a couple of dholes, and there was a really tiny jackal up ahead, and this jackal actually saw the dhole running towards that direction. The jackal saw the dhole and literally turned right back and started running away as fast as it could in the other direction. The second fascinating sighting, one of the most fascinating sightings I've ever seen, was actually when I'd gone for a trail a couple of months ago, and this was something super unexpected that I had never seen before. So I've seen a lot of fungoid frogs in the past, and fungoid frogs are small frogs, and bullfrogs are really, really huge frogs compared to them. They're like they're much, much bigger in size. And when I actually went for this trail, I saw a pond that had a really, really huge bullfrog that was swimming on the surface. And this tiny fungoid frog, I don't know why, has seen that bullfrog. There was so much space in the entire pond, but it has swam towards the bullfrog, jumped on the bullfrog, and started kicking the water. And the bullfrog eventually, after a few seconds, probably did not like that and submerged itself back into the water. And the third most fascinating sighting that I saw was the Oriental dwarf kingfisher that I saw with a fish in its mouth near a pond a few years ago, and that was one of the most fascinating sightings I've ever seen. I've only seen the Oriental dwarf kingfisher twice, and that was one of the times that I saw it, and it was super, super fascinating because I was literally waiting near the pond to see if I could see any kingfishers, and I thought I would see a common blue kingfisher or a white-throated kingfisher, but I saw a really, really beautiful Oriental dwarf kingfisher, and it had a fish in its mouth and was perched on a tiny branch near the pond, and they're one of the most beautiful birds ever. They literally are such they have such bright colors, and they're one of the most vividly colored birds ever, and that was definitely one of my favorite sightings that I've ever seen of a bird. Okay, so I know I already mentioned 3 wildlife sightings, but I'm actually going to mention a fourth one as well. During a safari in Pench a couple of years ago, I actually saw a really beautiful tawny eagle, and tawny eagles are one of the largest eagle species in the world. And what was really fascinating was that a few dholes, a group of dholes, had actually killed a chital deer. A few vultures actually came to scavenge on it as well, but a tawny eagle I saw in the safari actually flew near the vultures, took a piece of the carcass, and actually flew away with it. And they're really, really huge birds, you guys. It was one of the biggest birds I've ever seen, and I also saw a few vultures there as well, but I saw the tawny eagle fly off with a piece of meat away from the jackals and vultures, and that was one of the most fascinating moments I've ever seen. So definitely the tawny eagle during the safari was one of the most fascinating sightings I've ever seen. And yeah, I that was it for the wildlife sightings. And in Pench, what else did I see? I saw so many things in Pench, you guys. I can do like a few episodes where I just talk about Pench. I literally love Pench, and I love going for safaris over there. I have seen so many different animals over there. As I mentioned in my previous podcast, I actually saw Indian gores there for the first time. I saw chital there for the first time. I saw sambar deer there for the first time. I went for the first time there when I was really young, and I have been going there ever since so many times. So it's literally one of the most fascinating places in the world. And talking about a couple of fascinating sightings in Pench, actually around the hotel that I was staying at a couple of years ago, one day I went for bird watching around the hotel property as well. And that day was one of the most amazing days, you guys. Like, I saw so many birds just by walking around the property with the naturalist. It was about a 1.5 hour walk, but I still remember when we started, the first bird that I saw was a really beautiful owl. And I don't remember, it was a couple of years ago, but I'm gonna put the picture over here. I think it was a scops owl that I saw, and it was in the hollow of a tree. After that, during the trail, we literally saw a peacock, and that was super fascinating because this was right near the property, and because the jungles are so close by, peacocks are often seen out in the wild like that. And it was one of the most beautiful peacocks. And a few minutes later, we saw a lot of green bee eaters, and green bee eaters are one of the most beautiful birds. They actually love having dust baths as well. Since they live in such hot environments, they love having dust baths to cool themselves. They basically find a puddle of sand or mud, and they just basically rub their feathers on that to have a dust bath. And I also saw white-throated kingfisher. I saw a couple of herons. I saw the Indian pond heron, egrets as well. I saw a really, really beautiful. I don't remember what the name was. Yeah, a scaly breasted munya. I saw a couple of water hens. It was one of the most beautiful bird watching days ever because I got to see so many different birds. And I also saw a snake that day, you guys. We also saw a really, really beautiful Indian rat snake as well that day. And that was one of the most fascinating sightings. And what else? During bird watching, we saw a lot of birds, you guys, a lot of birds. And apart from the birds as well, we saw a few mammals as well. We saw squirrels. When we were walking back, we also saw a tiny hare crossing the path, so that was really fascinating. And overall, it was just amazing to go for a bird watching walk in the evening, so close to the property, and still see so many birds. And that was definitely one of the most fascinating bird watching trails that I've ever been for. And another bird watching trail that I had really found fascinating was when I had gone for bird watching in Shillong, and that was definitely one of the most fascinating bird watching walks ever because I saw a lot of jungle fowl that day. A lot of jungle fowl. They're one of the most striking, beautiful birds ever. I also saw a lot of spur fowl. A lot of spur fowl. They're tiny birds. They look like chickens and they live in the jungle. And they're the primary prey of small wild cats in the jungles, like jungle cats. So during that bird watching trail, I saw a couple of jungle fowl in Shillong. I saw a couple of spur fowl. I saw a lot of jungle babblers, and that's why I actually got to know that jungle babblers make so much noise. I had seen jungle babblers a lot of times before during safaris, but when I had gone for those trails in Shillong a few years ago, that was the first time I saw so many babblers, you guys. They were literally everywhere. And I also saw a couple of rain quails. They're one of the most beautiful birds ever, and they're literally super beautiful, you guys. And I also saw white-throated kingfisher. I saw these really tiny birds that I don't know what they are. I saw a really beautiful leaf bird, and during that morning walk as well, I was when I saw the Atlas moth, as I mentioned in the previous podcast, the largest moth species that I saw, and it was super fascinating. I also used to see a lot of crabs during these trails in Shillong. And these crabs, not only did I see the yellow crabs, I also saw red crabs. I also saw a lot of frogs and a lot of snails in that jungle. And I also saw a lot of black-winged kites there. I love black-winged kites. They're one of the most beautiful bird species ever. I also saw a lot of red-whiskered bulbuls and red-vented bulbuls. And a lot of times I have also seen in Shillong mynas and Oriental magpie robins and green bee eaters actually with a prey in its mouth. When whether it's a cockroach or a dragonfly, they'll be perched on like a branch on a tree or a wire, and they're basically eating the dragonfly, or they have like a bee in their mouth, and they're one of the most fascinating birds ever. And I literally love going for the bird watching trails in Shillong. And yeah, I think that's it for today's podcast, and I really hope you guys liked watching today's podcast. I'm gonna be uploading the next podcast next Wednesday as well. I upload a new podcast each Wednesday, and I hope you guys like this podcast, and hit the like button below, comment down below, and subscribe to my channel if you want to watch a new podcast every Wednesday. And hit the like button below, comment down below, and subscribe to my channel if you want to watch new podcasts every week from me. And I'll see you guys in the next podcast. Bye guys, stay safe and keep loving nature.